How do you advise people that are dealing with imposter syndrome?
Oh, everyone deals with that. Every time you make a status shift as you move upwards, of course you have imposter syndrome, because when you first make a transition into a new role, you are an imposter because you're a beginner. You don't know what you're doing. And that doesn't mean you're a liar or a fake. And it doesn't mean you should presume more knowledge than you have. It's, what did Nietzsche say? Every great man is an actor of his own ideal. And that feeds into the imposter syndrome in some sense. If you want to move to the next stage, at some point you have to act like you're already there when you're just barely started. And that's not a lie. You know, it's the willingness. It can be, and it can degenerate into a lie, especially if you presume more than you know. But if you move, you know, let's say you move from being an undergraduate to a graduate student. Well, all the other graduate students and the professors know that you're just a beginning graduate student. They're not going to expect as much from you as they would from a more seasoned graduate student. So you have some leeway that's genuine, but you are, you know, the low-rung occupier of that role. And of course you're going to feel like you're an imposter if you have any sense, because you're just barely there. You just made the transition. That's okay. You know, that's not a problem. First of all, you have to understand that everyone with any sense who isn't narcissistic feels that. And it's actually an indication of your mental health and your competence, as long as that doesn't become crippling. It shouldn't knock you out. I'm such a phony. Well, don't be a phony. That's the first thing. If you're dealing with competent people and you admit your ignorance, the competent people never judge you harshly for that, as long as you've been paying attention. So in my classes, for example, people were often afraid to ask questions. And so sometimes I would point to people and ask them if they had a question, especially the quieter types. And they'd be afraid to ask the question because, well, they're revealing their ignorance. And they would assume they're the only person in the room that's that ignorant, but they're not, because if they were paying attention and they had a question, the probability that half the class had that question was really high. That's different if you're not paying attention. And so you can be ignorant, you can be an ignorant newbie, and you can even ask the questions that are necessary to ask in that position and sort of reveal your inadequacy. And as long as you're dealing with competent people and you've been paying attention, they're just going to answer your questions. And then you only have to be ignorant once. That's the thing about asking a stupid question. You only have to ask it once, then you're no longer stupid. It's very difficult to calibrate how many units of physiological preparedness you should manifest per unit of threat. Mm-hmm. Right? Because how big's the threat? And the answer is, you don't know. You wake up in the morning and you have an ache in your side. Is that nothing? Or is that the cancer that's going to kill you in 6 months? And it's pretty low probability that it's the latter, but the probability is not zero. So why shouldn't you be panicked out of your mind? And the answer is, some people are. And sometimes they're right. So the calibration of threat, especially when it's associated with novelty, is an impossibly difficult computational problem. We have like 10 different mechanisms to try to solve that. And one of the mechanisms is, well, there's tremendous variability in response. And if you're higher in trait neuroticism, you're going to have the problem you're described all the time. You're going to be doubtful about your competence and the validity of your position. And the only treatment we really know for that is to expose yourself to things that you're afraid of voluntarily and to become braver as a consequence of doing that. But some people have to live with that more than other people.
The thing that I realized was that after a while, if you continue to disprove your imposter syndrome in the real world, you have a challenge, you're adamant that you probably won't or might not or don't deserve to get past it, and then you do, after a while, you have to admit to yourself that your imposter syndrome has nothing to do with your capacity and everything to do with your addiction about feeling like an imposter. And
well, and that does change as people age. Generally speaking, they become more agreeable, more conscientious, and lower in negative emotion. And some of that is that adaptation. You see that you've survived through various challenges, and then you can review that evidence to yourself, but also the people around you bolster you because they have confidence in you, and so their anxiety doesn't trigger your anxiety, and they'll remind you too, you know, you got this, you've done things in the past.
Such a wealth of data, you know, you've done it so many times.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think
And that does help. I mean, it does help. People get more confident as they get older, and they accrue experience because of that. But it's subject to that underlying trait variability and sensitivity to negative emotion. I mean, there's been good psychometric analysis of self-esteem scales and neuroticism scales. And they're pretty much the same thing reversed. And so, are you confident in yourself? Self-esteem. Do you lack confidence? Trait neuroticism. And so it is harder for some people because it takes more evidence for them to dampen down their response to threat. So, and it's partly because we're all adapted to some degree to the failure of induction, right? Just because something happened multiple times in the past does not mean necessarily that it will happen the next time. And that's it's the farmer and chicken problem, right? Farmer's always feeding the chicken. Chicken thinks the farmer's his best friend, but one day the chicken is dinner. And that's induction. There was a stable pattern in the past. You come to rely on it, but at any time that axiom can be disproved. And so the fact that we have variability in trait neuroticism is a consequence of the probability of the failure of induction. It's a very difficult problem to solve, how to regulate negative emotion. But I would say that the best way we know is to keep facing challenges voluntarily, pay attention at a rate that works for you, develop your competence. That actually stabilizes the environment around you, so it actually is less predictable and less threatening. Plus you accrue that evidence and you get the social support for doing so. That's your best pathway forward.
So there's this idea that Carl Jung developed. He extracted it, I don't know from where, from some ancient writings that he was familiar with. I believe they were Jewish writings. He said that, classically speaking, traditionally speaking, God was viewed to rule being with two hands, the right hand and the left hand, and the right hand was justice. And that was, you're going to get what's coming to you. But the left hand was mercy. And the idea essentially was that the cosmos could not exist without the proper combination of justice and mercy. You should get what's coming to you. But people are fallible and they make mistakes. And so it's reasonable to apply that to yourself. You know, there's an idea that's been developed by psychologists over the last few decades that people are basically narcissistic and that they generally feel that they're better at most things than other people. I don't buy that. I don't think the experimental evidence for that is very strong, and I certainly haven't seen that, for example, in my clinical practice, where I've seen that people are generally far harder on themselves than they are on other people. One example of that, I've written about this in my new book too, is that, you know, if you have a pet that's sick and you take it to the vet and you get medication, you're very likely to give the pet the entire course of medication, to go to the pharmacy to get the prescription filled, to give the pet the medication, to follow it through. But if you are the person who has the problem, yeah, you all laugh because you know the story. It's like a third of you won't even go fill the prescription, and of the remaining 2/3 of you, half won't take it to completion. And you think, well, why are people like that? And I think it's because they know themselves, they have contempt for themselves because of their flaws, and then they come to despise themselves. And I think that's a big mistake. That's too much justice and not enough mercy. And you know, Jung wrote about the biblical injunction that you should treat your neighbor as if he were yourself, essentially. But he talked about that as an equation, which was quite interesting. So, because it's often read as something like you should be nice to people, which is not what it means at all. Because first, nice is a very low-end virtue, but it isn't what it means. What it means is that you should treat your neighbor as if he or she is someone that you wish to encourage and develop, but that you should also have exactly the same attitude towards yourself, which is sort of in some sense regardless of what your opinion is of yourself. Critical, let's say, hypercritical even, which is often the case with people who are anxious or perhaps who are hyper-conscientious. You have to put forward to yourself the same sympathy, we could say, that you would extend to someone else that you cared for. That's the thing, is that you have to come to treat yourself as if you're someone that you care for. And I mean that technically. You know, you detach yourself from yourself and you think, okay, well, if I was going to construct a mode of being that was optimal for this person that I happen to be, what would that look like? And that's sort of independent of whether or not you think you deserve it. It's like, maybe you deserve it and maybe you don't. Innocent until proven guilty, that's a pretty good policy. But you should come to lay out a mode of being for yourself that gives you some credit, and that will also help you in your dealings with other people. But it's often very difficult for people to do that to themselves. We've been fed this unending diet of rights and freedoms, and there's something about that, there's something about that that's so pathologically wrong, and people are starving for the antidote, and the antidote is truth and responsibility, right? And it isn't because that's what you should do in some I know better or someone knows better for you what you should do sense. It's that's the secret to a meaningful life, and without a meaningful life, then all you have is suffering and nihilism and despair and all of that, and self-contempt, and that's not good. And so it's necessary for men to stand up and take responsibility, and they all know that and are starving for that message, and the message is more that that's also a good thing to stand up and take responsibility, because you're cursed so much now from when you're young with this notion that your active engagement with the world is part of what is destroying and undermining the planet and adding to the tyranny of the social systems. It's like, how about not so much of that, hey? Because it's too soul deadening. It's anti-human right to the core. And my sense instead is that, if you were able to reveal the best of yourself to you in the world, that you would be an overwhelming force for good, and that whatever errors might be made along the way would wash out in the works. And that's the other thing that you see in the Abrahamic stories, because Abraham is not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. He's a real person, and he makes mistakes, but it doesn't matter. The overarching narrative is, maintain your covenant with God, and despite your inadequacies, then not only will you prevail, but your descendants will prevail. It's like, great, that's really good news, So it's been really something to see that in this story. Genuine ethical virtue is it's the only source of resilience and strength that you have. And it's also the place, as far as I can tell, that the meaning that allows you to set yourself against suffering resides. People talk about life and its meaning, and they say, well, life is meaningless, but people never mean that, because if you're in pain or you're terrified, you're overwhelmed with meaning. It's just not the kind of meaning you want. And it's not a reality you can talk yourself out of easily. And that's particularly true of pain, but it can also be true of anxiety. And so the question is there a reliable source of meaning that you can set against that? And what's its nature, if so? And so here's a way of conceptualizing it to some degree. So I'm currently in a rather remote location in Northern Ontario. And one of the advantages to being here is that I can go out on my dock at night and I can look up and see the night sky. And when you see the night sky, when it's pitch black, you are face to face with something as near to the infinite as we can face in a prosaic day-to-day setting. And so there's an experience that goes along with that, and the experience is one of awe and wonder. And awe is a very interesting emotion. Let's say it's unbelievably ancient from a biological perspective. So if you feel awe, your hair might stand up on end. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you get that feeling, chills running down your back, say when you're listening to music that you particularly enjoy. And that's a variant of the reflex that prey animals have when they see a predator. Their hair stands on end so that they look bigger. Now, of course, they don't know that. So part of that feeling of awe is tied to our ancient mammalian heritage. It's a variation of the response we had to a predator. We're in the face of we're facing something much greater than ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so, but there's more to it if you think it through, because when you
face the night sky, for example, or you face something, confront something that fills you with wonder and awe, there's also a call to action that's sort of implicit in it. And maybe you think, well, the wolf is calling to the rabbit to be better at defending itself in some sense, to be a better rabbit, because otherwise, man, you're going to be eaten by the wolf. And when you look up in the night sky, to the night sky, and you feel awe, there's a call there. It's part of that experience to imitate that great thing that you perceive. Now, you might say, well, how can you imitate the infinite cosmos as well? Obviously, that's a very complicated question. But, you know, you're a very complicated thing. And God only knows what it means for you to imitate the infinite when you apprehend it. I mean, that's, in some sense, that's the fundamental question of life, is how do we adapt ourselves to the infinite complexity that surrounds us? What must we become? Well, you don't merely think that through. And I mean, you don't, I don't, human beings in general don't. We puzzle it out, and we use all sorts of information to do that. And some of these more primordial experiences that are outside the domain of strict rationality nonetheless point us in an ethical direction. And the ethic would be, you should and could be more than you are. Well, then the question is, how do you bring that to earth? How does that look when you try to embody it day to day? Mm-hmm. Well, I would say these are obviously not my ideas. They're very old ideas. Well, maybe you ally yourself with truth to the degree that you can. Maybe you pursue beauty. Maybe you pursue the love that attaches you appropriately to other people, etc., etc. And you do that because, well, I think you do it because life is very, very difficult. Gray developed a theory of emotion that's predicated on the idea that, essentially on the idea that most of your emotions are experienced in relationship to a goal.
Okay.
And so you establish a goal, then movement towards that goal, or evidence that you could move towards that goal, makes you happy, produces positive emotion, whereas evidence that the goal is invalid or that you're blocked in some way produces negative emotion. Mm-hmm. So you lay this map on the world. It always has a destination point in mind. There's always a destination point implicit in it or explicit in it. So it works as subtly as this, for example. So if you walk into your room and you want to walk towards something to pick it up, and your room is cluttered because you've been careless, all that clutter manifests itself as an obstacle to your goal and produces negative emotion. And you experience that instantaneously, essentially, and automatically. And so part of the reason, that I encourage people to clean up their rooms, let's say, is, well, it's a microcosm of all this. Your room is part of your experience that you have control over. And it's easy to underestimate its significance, but that's a place you can alter. You can set it up for whatever it is that you're doing. Well, what are you doing? Well, that's the first question you have to ask yourself if you're going to set up your room. It's not trivial. It's hard. One of the things you can be virtually certain of in life is that you don't get something you don't aim at. And one of the things that's interesting about that is often people will keep their goals fuzzy. Because one of the problems with specifying your goals is you specify your failures, right? If the goal is really fuzzy, you're not sure when you fail, and then you can fool yourself. Really, but you can kind of keep it foggy. But you make your goals sharp and clear. Then, well, first of all, then you know what to aim at. And what's interesting is, your brain is set up so that it reorganizes the world around your aims. And that's not, I've also written about this in 12 Rules for Life quite extensively, and that's not a metaphor. Like, we don't see much of the world, because there's a lot of the world and there isn't much of us. And so we see what we aim at, we aim with our eyes. And here's an example. So, like, great apes don't really have much of a white in their eyes.
but human beings do. And the reason for that is that we've evolved to detect where everyone else is looking. And so if I can't tell where you're looking, I don't know what you're up to. And then, well, over time, that means I can't read you as well, and we're more likely to get in a dispute, and one or the other of us is more likely to get killed. But it also means that your probability of finding a successful mate decreases. So we've evolved to have this very, very visually evident eye. And so when we're looking at each other, we're always looking at our eyes, because then we can tell where someone is pointed, and then we can tell what they're up to. And so we're hunting creatures, like we're aiming at a moving target and trying to track it all the time. And so you have to specify your aim. And it's more than one aim. It's like you have a highest aim, which you might say is to be a good person. And then I would say, well, there's a more elaborated aim than that. It's like you want to be able to constrain malevolence and work to decrease suffering. It's something like that. That's the highest aim. And then you have to decompose that into the things you do each day, so that there's a definite connection between all the micro actions and the macro aim, and then that gives dignity to what you're doing.
This person isn't carrying their load, and they think I should do their work. What should I do now? And the answer is, yeah. Someone wants you to do their work. Do their work.
Yes,
do their work.
Yes,
I'll do that all day long.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, you don't want to do your job. That's fine. I'll do it. Yeah. And actually, I just answered a question where somebody said, the guy's a friend of mine, and he's not carrying his load. What should I do? And I said, well, how about you help him? What's going on at home? Is he going through a divorce? Has he got issues? Is his kid sick? How about you help him and say, hey, let me take that off your plate right now? Because in 2 months or 6 months, you might be the person that needs help. You might be the person with a sick child. But regardless of that, maybe he's just as lazy, and maybe he shouldn't be your friend, and maybe eventually he won't be your friend. But nonetheless, the solution is the same. If you don't want to do your work, that's fine. I'll do it for you.
Yeah, well, that's such a funny thing. That's exactly right. Because, what you want to do in your job is make yourself indispensable, right? And the way you make yourself indispensable is by being indispensable. And the way you do that is by doing a bunch of things that, if they're not done, catastrophe occurs. And that's exactly right. So if there's someone around you and they're abdicating their responsibility and you can pick it up, it's like, what an opportunity. You think, well, I'm not going to get credit for it. It's like, well, first of all, there's lots of different forms of credit, but you learn. And then when the company shrinks and they're looking at who to keep, they think, oh, well, it turns out you're doing all sorts of things. We can't do without you. That's not what we expected. We can't do without you. Here's some more things you could do. And then you're also in a position to bargain. You can say, well, look, in order for me to keep doing this level of responsibility, I need to be paid more because I have other options, or because it's just, or because that will make me more efficient. But then you've got some power too, because they need you. And so indispensability, and that's power. Indispensability is power, not tyranny. You can't exist outside of a framework of value. It's not possible. It's not technically possible. I outline this in quite a bit of detail in chapter 10, which is called Rule 10, which is called be precise in your speech, is that the way the world manifests itself to you is integrally tied to your value structure. And that's because, to put it very simply, is that your very vision is dependent on an aim. Like whenever you look at the world, you're aiming at something. You're aiming at something with your eyes. You can't focus on something without aiming at it, and you won't aim at it without valuing it. So your very perceptions are dependent on your value structure. Now that doesn't mean there isn't a world. It does mean that experience is a complex interplay of your value structure and the unmanifest world. It's something like that. And then that begs the question, which is, well, if you have to have a value structure, then what should it be? Well, and then that brings us back to the ideas that we were talking about earlier. Like you should value being. You should take on the responsibility of being as your highest ethical obligation and try to improve it, try to reduce suffering, try to make the most out of yourself in a way that's beneficial to you and your family and your community. You should aim high, and your perceptions will reconfigure themselves around those aims, and that will allow the world to manifest itself to you in the most positive possible manner, or at least in the most meaningful possible manner. And in the absence of that, all you have is stupid suffering. That is the anxiety and depression that we talked about earlier. Without a point, without value, without an aim, all you're left with is the misery and anxiety of life. That makes people bitter.
I love to bring up the notion of the aim, because one can react to this stupid suffering in a number of ways, but this is so clear. You write in it, you say, you cannot aim yourself at anything if you are completely undisciplined and untutored. Mm-hmm. You will not know what to target, you won't fly straight, even if you do get your aim right. And then you will conclude there is nothing to aim for, and then you will be lost. And these days, the prevailing moral framework, as I see it, is if it feels good, do it. How is it that discipline and the straight and narrow offer the best chance for a good life? And how is it that we have forgotten that is the case?
Well, the reason that discipline is necessary is because you're a mass of competing short-term interests. And so the question is then, well, which short-term interest should win out? And the answer to that is, well, none of them. They need to be organized into a hierarchy that makes them functional across time and across individuals. So like a 2-year-old is very likely to act out his or her proximal impulse. But of course, a 2-year-old can't survive in the world. You have to bring your primary instincts, let's say, under the regulatory structure of a higher order value system that allows them to manifest themselves without undue mutual sacrifice across large spans of time in the presence of large numbers of other people. So that requires a very sophisticated ordering. It's like, we already talked about the fact that a meta-narrative is necessary to unite subcultures, say, so that they can operate peacefully and harmoniously within the same space. The same thing applies within you, because you're an internal coalition of warring, single-minded tribes, and they have to all be brought under the organizational structure of long-term collective vision, let's say. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, you have to be disciplined. And any discipline, technically speaking, is an attempt to bring all those competing short-term impulses under a larger scale and more inclusive framework. And so you do that, and then, well, that's actually what gives you freedom. Being impulsive and being free aren't the same things, because if you're impulsive, you're just the slave of your impulses.
Right.
There's no freedom in that. That's the same freedom, so to speak, literally, that a 2-year-old has, because a 2-year-old isn't socialized yet. So that doesn't function in the sophisticated world. It doesn't work.
Right.
Everyone knows it.
We just like to pretend sometimes to say, oh, that does feel good, Now, I have one
last...
Well,
we like to pretend all the time, because that's why we go out and drink, because drinking enables you to blind yourself to the long-term consequences of your actions. And there's no doubt that that's very, very rewarding in the short term, but it's also why you wake up the next morning hungover and ashamed.
People need the opportunity to be good at something. So then you might ask yourself, well, what's the best antidote to the discomfort of life? And you might say, well, it's comfort. And I suppose that's what you act out when you swaddle a baby. But a better antidote is something like adventure to excellence. And that's far better antidote to suffering than the mere absence of suffering. So, not to say that the mere absence of suffering, that's not nothing,
Stepping out of that sedation from comfort's difficult, though, especially if you've become routinized to it.
Yeah, well, that's the difficulty of maturity. The Freudians said very wisely that the good mother necessarily fails.
What's that mean?
It means she stops providing the comfort that insulates people against the need for adventure.
I heard you say recently that a mother's ability to let her child go out into the world, knowing that they're still vulnerable and that it's now down to them and the world to look after them, that's one of the bravest things that they can do. It's
the female crucifixion. And that's exemplified best in, the best portrayal of that I've seen is Michelangelo's Pieta. It's a statue of Mary and she has Christ's body on her as an adult on her lap, and he's broken and destroyed, and she's displaying that. And that's the bravery of a mother, to allow that to happen, but not only that, to facilitate it. So
what about
way you go, kid? Way you go. Well, why? It's dangerous out there. It's like, yeah, no kidding. It's more dangerous here if you stay with me. By a lot. So you might lose your body out there in the world, but if you stay here, you lose your soul.
Don't have one plan, right? If you're going to stake yourself on something, you should throw a couple of alternative scaffolds up beside you so that you have somewhere to go. You want to be a doctor. Okay, well, you could be a nurse. It's like, it's not a doctor, but it beats cutting your throat. You're still doing 80% of what you wanted to do. So you want to think about this during your whole life, man. If you're going to take a high risk, you want to scaffold yourself in other areas so that if it fails, the bottom doesn't drop out and you die. And it's also very much worth thinking about with regards to setting up your life in general. It's like, if you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius-level mathematician, and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is, you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it, and I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is, the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. So they're different value, they're different, there's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, Really, really, that's what you want. Because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people. You know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never, ever catch up.
A woman is extremely bonded with her infant, say between 0 and 9 months, and the infant is utterly helpless. And so complete compassion and the provision of comfort is the only job that matters, and that's really the case. And then the woman has to switch gears to some degree. The mother has to switch gears as the child starts to become more mobile, fundamentally, and more independent. She has to let go of the infant, which is a real grieving process, and she has to start to facilitate this movement towards independence. But that's a hard shift, and so partly the role of the father in that is to be an advocate for the child's independence and to comfort the mother, to let her know that that degree of security provision is no longer necessary, but also to act as an advocate for the child's outgoing desire. And so it's the Oedipal situation is not only the mother, it's also, say, the weak father, but then it's also the child. So you can imagine, because Jung believed that these negotiated agreements were relational. So, you know, you're 6, you're in grade 1, maybe you're feeling a little ill, maybe you're not, maybe you're playing with being a little ill, and maybe you're playing with exaggerating how ill you are, and your mom comes downstairs and says, you know, you've got a test today at school, maybe you haven't quite prepared for it, maybe you know you should have, and she says, but you know, you seem to have a tummy ache, maybe you're too sick to go to school. And the kid thinks, well, maybe I could just stay home and, you know, mom could tuck me in and I wouldn't have to take that test and I wouldn't have to confront the world. And he says, yeah, mom, my stomach really hurts. And away we go. And the child has made a choice. And you think, well, that's a catastrophic choice. And you think, well, children shouldn't be held accountable for choices they make at that age. It's like,
that child's soon going to be an adult that's going to make very similar decisions.
The choice has consequences, and to be held accountable for that is to recognize purely that the choice has consequences and that it is a choice. Now, you know, you could say, well, 95% of the blame is to be put on the mother, and maybe that's an overestimate. I think it probably is. But the child could say, Mom, you don't have to worry about me. I'm going to get up and go do this. And that's choice. And that's the right choice. So these are always chicken and egg problems, obviously, but that fleshes out the complexity of the situation. You know, if you're being enticed down a pathological road, you can accept or reject the invitation. Now, some people are better at enticing and some people enforce it more harshly. And, you know, there's all sorts of individual variability in situations like this, but just because you're offered the bait doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take it. So, and I'm not a determinist. I do believe that people have free will, whatever that means. That's a murky subject and it gets complicated the more you look at it, but whatever. It's still a good shorthand way of describing the fact that we seem to be cursed with responsibility for our own destiny, at least to some degree.
We're built to walk uphill. And when you reach the pinnacle of the hill, you want to stop and appreciate the vision, but the next thing you want is a higher hill in the distance, because it's the uphill climb that it's from the uphill climb that we derive our value. And I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's to be filled with the Spirit of God, by the way, because that's what enthusiasm means. That's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, and this is part of the religious enterprise, you want a goal that you can never attain, right? So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever-expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal. It was in your case. But then you think, well, now I'm there. Now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the face. What do you want to be? A giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, well, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand, and that's dynamic, that's exciting, and that's why so many young men disappear into video games. That's all acted out in the video game. So they have to act that out in their own life. Thrownness is the fact that we kind of experience life as if we're tossed into it, thrown into it. You know, you're male and not female. You're Hindu and not Christian. You're tall and not short. You have an arbitrary range of talents and an arbitrary range of limitations, none of which, in some sense, you chose. It's the cards you're dealt. Now, some of those are cards of privilege. Now, maybe you're born intelligent. Maybe you're born symmetrical. Maybe you're born healthy. Maybe you're born into a culture where it's much easier not to be absolutely deprived. Maybe your parents are rich. And so all of that, in some sense, is unearned. Now, along with that comes a good dose of existential guilt, because at the same time, and this is true for anyone, regardless of their cultural background, the ground we walk on is soaked in the blood of historical atrocity. And so that's on you, because, you know, people think, well, who's the Nazi? Well, it's the fascist, or who's the radical communist? It's the radical left-wing ideologue. And the fundamental truth of the matter is that's best dealt with as a spiritual matter, is the adversary is within, really, most profoundly. And so you have to take the responsibility for that historical atrocity onto yourself. I was talking to Guy Ritchie this week about his movie King Arthur. It's quite an interesting movie in many ways. And when Arthur, who could be the hero, takes the sword, he's so overcome by visions of his murderous uncle that he can't pick up the weapon. Well, think about that. Now, you have weapons at your disposal, but they've been used by your murderous uncle. How dare you wield them? And the answer is, maybe it's easy just to leave the sword on the ground, because you do want to be responsible for atrocities going forward, and don't think you couldn't be, and don't think you might not enjoy it. And so, the way you pay for your privilege is with your virtue. I mean that most particularly. You have these opportunities and this existential guilt. And the way you expiate that and atone is by doing your best to live the best possible life you can manage, to speak the truth, to treat people with respect, to abide by the principles of the dignity of the individual, and to put your house in order. And that's how you pay for your unearned privilege. All of us. And we all have our privileges and our curses, you know. All of us have that. That's why it's not useful to be envious of people. You know, you're a young man, you see someone drive by in a Ferrari with a blonde, and you think, my God,
he's got everything. And, you know, the woman in the car is a prostitute who's got a cocaine addiction, and her life is just one catastrophe after another. And he's had to lie and cheat his way into this position, and he's afraid that everything's going to come crashing down on him, and that's what you're jealous of. And it's just not that profound. You don't want someone else's fate. Man, your fate's enough, and your adventure's enough. It's plenty. It's more than you can ever fully realize. And so that's also part of the reason that we all believe that the individual has some intrinsic dignity. It's don't be so sure that your position and your room is so damn trivial. It might be your attitude towards it that's trivial. And if you're in dire straits and dire circumstances, just look at how much opportunity you have to make things better.
We asked that question with good intentions. Are you happy? What's a better question for me to ask Jordan Peterson?
How are you doing?
How are you doing? How are you doing?
Brilliantly and terribly. That's you know, when you listen to a profound piece of music, one that sort of spans the whole emotional experience, it's not happy. Happy is elevator music, and probably you just shouldn't listen to that at all, right? And you think, why? Well, it's harmless, it's treacly, it's sweet, it's simple, it lacks depth, it's shallow, that's a problem. It doesn't have that deep sense of awe and horror, I would say, that is characteristic of the best of all music. You know, you listen to some simple music, so-called. Hank Williams is a good example. You know, the blues cowboy from the 50s who died of alcoholism when he was 27 and whose voice sounds like an 80-year-old man. Simple melody, you know, but there's nothing simple in the song and in the voice. It's deep, you know, it's like the blues. It's like black blues in the States from the 20s, and it was certainly influenced by that tradition. There's this admission of a deep suffering at the same time as you get the beautiful transcendence of the music. And that's meaning, you know, that's awful in the most fundamental sense, but you need an antidote to suffering, and it has to be deep. And you know, deep moves you tectonically, and it's not a trivial thing. But that's better than happiness. And maybe if you're lucky while you're pursuing that and while you're immersed in it, you get to be happy, and you should fall on your knees and be grateful for that when it happens. You know, it's a gift. It really is a gift. And it comes upon you unexpectedly, your happiness, you know. But you aim to climb uphill to the highest peak you can possibly envision. And that's better than happiness. I started doing what I'm doing back in, say, probably 1985, because I realized that one of the pathways to totalitarian catastrophe was deceit at the individual level. This is something that Solzhenitsyn made very much of, Orwell as well, Huxley as well. These great thinkers concluded in the aftermath of these totalitarian catastrophes that there was an integral link between pathology at the individual level, which was fundamentally the willingness to use deceit in an instrumental manner. I'll lie to you to get what I want, and authoritarian catastrophe, and that it was a direct causal link. And I actually buy that argument. I think that's literally true. And so partly what I'm doing, I hope, is helping people walk through thinking about why telling the truth is a good idea. Not only for them, not as a top-down, shake your finger moral injunction, don't lie, you shouldn't lie, but in a detailed manner to explain the relationship between the instrumental use of deceit and the collapse of civilizations. And that connection is way closer than people think. You know, so one person influences 1,000 people for sure in their lifetime, and sometimes a lot more than that. And 1,000, you know, the next rung out from that, 1,000 times 1,000 is 1,000,000, and the next rung out from that is 1,000,000,000. And so you're always at the center of a concentric circle that 2 rungs out contains 1,000,000,000 people. Well, it turns out that what you do matters. And basically what I'm doing, as I hope, is touring and talking to people face to face in these lectures, for example, and making the case that it's a terrifying case. Everyone says, well, we want meaning in our life. It's do you now? Do you now? Because you might ask yourself, what's the more threatening possibility? That nothing you do matters, which means you can pretty much do whatever you want. That's the upside of that nihilistic claim, no responsibility, right? And why not pursue narrow-focused hedonism, since nothing matters anyways? So that's the shadow of nihilism. Or everything you do matters. And it's a lot more terrifying to contemplate that, is that you will be held accountable for everything you do. And I believe that firmly, partly as a consequence of my clinical experience. I never saw any one of my clinical clients ever get away with anything, even once. And you think, well, people get away with things all the time. It's like, no, they don't. They might gain a narrow advantage in one dimension in the short term. But, you know, let's say that you use deceit in your business practices. First of all, that doesn't work very well because people will figure you out. So as a long-term as a long-term strategy, it's terrible. It just doesn't work. No one is going to play with you if you're a cheat. But let's say that someone asked me the other day, well, what about these dictators that ruled their whole life, and they were at the top of the hierarchy, let's say, and they had all the power. Stalin's a perfectly good example. It's like, didn't he win? Well, everyone Stalin ever talked to lied to him because they were absolutely bloody terrified of him. His country was a nightmare. It was a hell, or as close as we've been able to produce, with the possible exception of the Nazis and the Maoists, but it was up there in terms of hell. And did he rule? Yes, but he ruled hell. And if you think that's a victory, well, go ahead and try it and see how much of a victory it is. You know, Milton Satan said, I'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. It's like, fair enough, go ahead. Use deceit, use instrumentality, rule in hell. You'll be the ruler. See how much good it does you. See where that takes you. It takes you somewhere terrible. For the first time in my life, really, I believe this to be the case, conservatives really have something to sell to young people. And they can sell the meaning of responsibility, because young people are bereft of meaning. And most people find meaning in responsibility. And when the right talks about responsibility, they kind of do it in that finger-wagging way that makes conservatives unpopular among young people. You should be responsible. It's like, yeah, you should. Why? Well, because your life is chaotic and meaningless, and you're stuck in this juvenile surreality, and it's really painful for you, and you're anxious and aimless and goalless. And then you look at people who have a life, because maybe you could have a life, and you think, well, what does that life consist of? It's like, well, you have a committed, intimate relationship. There's one. You have friends that you're honest with and playful with. So you have a group of friends. You have a job or a career. No, you learn how to use your life, your time outside of work in a productive, engaging way. You regulate your susceptibility to the multitude of hedonistic temptations that are in front of you. You pay some attention to your mental and physical health. You make a goal, some goals for the future that are concrete. Well, there's 7 things you can do. They're all responsible things. Why? Because then your life will have some meaning. Now, you might say, well, what's the ultimate meaning? It's like, get those things straight first. They're not nothing. And maybe you won't be so damn miserable and bitter and resentful and angry and aimless and anxious and frustrated and disappointed and then ashamed if you had 5 of those 7 things going well.
And the psychoanalysts, I think, err too much on the side of the subject. They tend to think that too much of you is inside of you and too little of you is outside of you. And part of the reason I believe that is because of my clinical experience. I love the psychoanalysts, man. they're brilliant, they're deep. They grapple with real problems, like with the problems, when people have real problems, and I mean profound problems, they're really profound moral problems, they're problems of good and evil, really. You know, there are things going on in their family that are so terrible that, well, that they're sometimes fatal, you know, lie upon lie upon lie upon lie for decades and decades and decades. It's awful. And that's not exactly inside them. It's out there in the world. And lots of the people that I see, very famous critic of psychology, criticized the practice of psychology quite effectively I believe in the early 60s. And he basically said, most people have problems in living, they don't have psychological problems. And so I've experienced, despite my love for the psychoanalysts, very frequently what I'm doing as a therapist is helping people have a life that would work. You know, and you can parameterize that. It's like, what do you need? How about some friends? That people kind of like that. How about an intimate relationship with someone that you can trust, that maybe has a future? That'd be good. How about a career that puts you in a dominance hierarchy somewhere, so at least you've got some possibility of rising, some possibility of stabilizing yourself, and a schedule and a routine, because no one can live without a routine. You just forget that. If you guys don't have a routine, I would recommend, like, you get one going, because you cannot be mentally healthy without a routine. You need to pick a time to get up. Whatever time you want, but pick one and stick to it, because otherwise you dysregulate your circadian rhythms and they regulate your mood. And eat something in the morning. So, a schedule, that's a good thing, man. Your brain will thank you for it. It will stabilize your nervous system. With a bit of a plan, that's a good thing. You need a career, you need something productive to do with your time. You need to regulate your use of drugs and alcohol, most particularly alcohol, because that does in a lot of people. You need a family, like the family you have, your parents and all that. It'd be nice if you all got along, you could work on that. That's a good thing to work on. And then, you know, you probably need children at some point. And that's life. That's what life is. And if you're missing, you know, you may have a good reason to not be operating on one of those dimensions. It's not mandatory. But I can tell you that if you're not operating reasonably well on 4, I think I mentioned 6, if you're not operating reasonably well on at least 3 of them, there's no way you're going to be psychologically thriving. And that's more pragmatic in some sense than psychological, right? Human beings have a nature. There's things we need. And if we have them, well, that's good. And if we don't have them, well, then we feel the lack. And so behaviorists, behavioral psychologists concentrate a lot more on that sort of thing. You know, it's practical. It's like strategizing. Make a career plan. Figure out how to negotiate, because that's bloody important. Figure out how to say what you need. Figure out how to tell the truth to people. Figure out how to listen to your partner in particular, because if you listen to them, they will actually tell you what they want. And sometimes you can give it to them and maybe they'll return the favor. And if you practice that for like 15 years, well, then maybe you're constantly giving each other what you want. Well, hooray, that would be good. And then there's 2 of you under most circumstances, and it's better to have 2 brains than 1, because people think differently because of their temperament mostly. And so the negotiation is where the wisdom arises, and it's part of the transformation, the psychological transformation that's attendant on an intimate relationship, and one of the fundamental purposes of a long-term intimate relationship.
I'm trying to get a hold of the Disney people at the moment because I want to do a lecture series on Pinocchio, because I think Pinocchio is a brilliant work of art. And if you're a puppet and an actor, and Pinocchio is both at times in that movie, both a puppet and an actor. So why an actor? Like, why is there something wrong with being an actor? Well, the first question is, well, who sets your role? And then the second question is, who's pulling your strings? So you've put on this front that is there to make you popular and sexy and desirable and to mask from yourself your own inadequacies. But that's a role. Well, who wrote it? And for what purpose? And so Jung said, for example, that we all acted out a myth, whether we knew it or not. And maybe you're acting out a tragedy. Maybe you're acting out Narcissus. You don't know, because you've put that on yourself in an attempt, in some ways, to deliver to people what they want, or more accurately, to look as though you're delivering to people what they want. And it's not nothing to do that, right? Because at least you're attempting, in some sense, to adapt to the social world. Someone who's really infantile and dependent, someone who's never left home, part of their problem is that they haven't crafted a persona. So you don't want to denigrate it entirely, but it's no substitute for the real thing. And it turns out that not only is what we want from each other the real thing, but that's also the adventure of your life. And so if you aren't truthful, and that means, unfortunately, especially at the beginning, when you start to be truthful, it means deeply coming to terms with your inadequacies in humility. So it's very painful. Without that, you don't have the adventure of your life. You have the role that you've acquiesced to. And that'll take all the meaning out of your life. So when I was doing my clinical work, which I did a lot of career work with my clients, both at a beginner level, I would say, like really a beginner level, with people who had no employment whatsoever, no history of employment, who were undereducated and who lacked every skill you could possibly imagine. So these were people who were really in dire straits, up to people who were operating at the top of their profession, but who could still strategize forward. And so, for example, let's say you're at a dead end in your job. Okay, so I don't find my work meaningful. All right, so that's a problem statement. It's like, well, why not? I find the work I do repetitive and boring and without spirit. I have a bad relationship or a neutral relationship with my boss who doesn't know who I am. I have problems with coworkers. All of that needs to be differentiated, right, and analyzed in detail. So we might say, for example, let's say you believe that you're undervalued at work, and maybe you are. What you need to do is you have something to say, and we would have to figure out what it is that you have to say. But it would be some variant of, I'm bringing more value to the table than I am being compensated for, and that's demoralizing me. And it's also not good for you being my boss, because if I'm actually more valuable than is being recognized, then the fact that you're not valuing me properly means that I will become demoralized, I won't work properly, and you won't get the best out of me. So it's bad for both of us. And if your boss is in principle not amenable to such a discussion, then what you should seriously consider doing is finding another job. Okay, so let's say we're going to set you up for this. Okay, this isn't like next week's enterprise, man. This is your life. So the first thing I would ask is, well, do you have your resume or CV in order? Well, I haven't typed it up for 3 years. Well, what do you think about bringing it up? Well, I'm pretty nervous about that because there's some holes in it, and I didn't do so well in college, and I'm kind of embarrassed about my resume. It's like, okay, bring it in. Let's go through it. Let's at least update it. Let's look where the holes are. Let's look at where the inadequacies are as far as you're concerned, right? This isn't my judgment, it's your judgment. Let's walk through those judgments and see if they're warranted, because maybe you're just too guilty and ashamed and self-conscious and anxious, and you're looking at your resume more critically than someone else would. And maybe there's some holes that you need to rectify. You were 2 courses away from your BA and you dropped out or something like that. Well, maybe we need 6 months to address that. And at least, even if you can't be fully educated, you could be taking some courses online. And so when you went to a new job interview and they said, what about this hole? You'd say, well, I came to terms with that 6 months ago, and in an effort to rectify it, I'm taking the following courses, and here's my plan for completion. That's a really good answer. And anyone with any sense who's interviewing will accept that as an indication that although you're not perfect, and who is, that you have a good plan and that you've thought it through. Like, that's the kind of answer that
in all likelihood, will cement your candidacy for the position. Okay, so now you're going to go to your boss. Well, you have to have your CV and your resume in order, and you have to be able to stand on it solidly, and which at least means that you're prepared to address the inadequacies in a credible, realistic, believable, and truthful manner. All right, now what you do is apply for like 10 jobs. You don't have to take them, but maybe you have to go to an interview or 2 or 3 or 4, and maybe there's a bunch of opportunities out there for you that you didn't even know about. And maybe someone offers you a job. And so now you can go to your boss and say, here's the situation I'm in here at work. Here's my evaluation of the problems in relationship to me. Here's what I could do for you if you gave me a 40% raise and the opportunity to progress, but I'd like to see a plan for that. And I've been looking for other opportunities before conducting this discussion, and I have some. Well, then, if your boss treats you with contempt at that point and doesn't listen, then perhaps he or she is a little more narcissistic than might be optimal, and it's time to find a new job. But this isn't something you do trivially. And so when you're doubtful, say you're trapped, you ask yourself, well, why am I trapped? And that's a hard question, right? Because some of it's your own inadequacy, a lot of it, and all of the part of it that you can deal with is your own inadequacy. So even if it's unfair, even if you're hemmed in for any number of reasons, inappropriate, like ethnically predicated oppression, let's say, or maybe you're in a workplace that really is sexist in some fundamental sense. Well, that's not good. It's not just, it's not fair, it's not meritorious, all of those things. And maybe you shouldn't be there. But what you can do to begin with is every bloody thing you possibly can do to put yourself in the most virtuous and powerful negotiating position possible. And you have to think like a snake in some sense. To do that, you got to get the details right. You have to be prepared to bite, and you have to have your eyes on the prize, so to speak. If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this, like you got to be desperate. This is no game, this. It's like, my life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that is make me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, homicidal, genocidal, unable to have a good relationship, prone to punish people for their virtues because of my jealousy, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. Like, what's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong, that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. And it's often something that will point you to small things. So Carl Jung said, people in the modern world don't see God because they don't look low enough. And so imagine you're in your messy bedroom, and you're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself. And the little voice says, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And that works. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly. Physical attractiveness is extensively studied in departments of psychology. How big of a determinant of success is it apart from IQ or any of the other big 5 traits? That's tough one, because physical attractiveness is a very complex trait. It's also, for example, it's a marker of health, and of course, health is a prerequisite for success. So, you can't take attractiveness as a unitary dimension and measure it sufficiently accurately. Wait, I should back up on that. No one that I know of has taken physical attractiveness as a unitary concept, measured it accurately, and then pitted it against IQ and the big 5 to see to what degree it adds incremental validity to the prediction of long-term success. And so I can't give you a technical answer. I can say, well, in a complex job over the long run, IQ accounts for maybe 20% of the variance in success, leaving 80% there for random events and the big 5 traits and connection networks and family background and all those other things, gender perhaps, that all the other things that determine success. We know that people who are physically attractive, though, are given the benefit of doubt by other people. They benefit from the positive halo effect, and the positive halo effect is the propensity of people to assume good things about someone if there is one outstanding thing about them that's easily evident, that's good. And so if you stand up straight with your shoulders back, so that's rule 1 in 12 rules for life, then people are going to see you as more attractive. If you're symmetrical, you're more attractive. If you're thin but not too thin, you're more attractive. And then there's like good skin and good teeth and good hair and all of those things, and proper proportions and youth, and there's a whole slew of things that feed into that. If you are characterized by a plethora of those features, then people are also going to assume that you're more competent and more worth having around, let's say. But the problem is that you are. So separating out the attractiveness from the things the attractiveness is correlated with is very hard. That's why you have to do multivariate analysis. That's multivariable analysis in any complex social science, because a lot of these traits overlap. So, but you can there's some things you can do about that. Postural adjustment is helpful. To work out with weights, that's extraordinarily helpful. That improves your posture and makes you more confident, and you can dress reasonably well and intelligently, and all of those things to help yourself capitalize on whatever attractiveness you can muster. How do you dress so well? Any tips? Well, thank you. I started buying nice clothes, let's say, this year, really. I had some decent suits before that. I did some research online to find out who good suit manufacturers were. You can look that up. But before this tour, I went and talked to a good tailor, expensive place. I felt terrible spending so much money on clothing. But I felt that if I was going to go talk to, it's been 200,000 people, that I was going to do it right, and I was going to invest in some decent clothes. And even though it hurt my cheap Northern Alberta soul to do it, it was definitely worth it. So you go talk to someone who knows what they're doing. Go talk to an actual tailor, and you can do some research online. There's lots of resources online that are devoted to helping men figure out how to dress. 3-piece suits look really good. I've got them tailored and fitted, so they're not bespoke suits. They're off the rack, but they've been tailored, and that makes a big difference. All the subtle things that tailors do, they tuck it in around the waist, they cut it to your body, all of those things help. It's really good to have a good pair of shoes, a couple of nice ties. I learned how to tie a full Windsor knot recently, and that actually helps. You don't want your tie to look too skinny. Lots of people have been dressing up to come to my talk, so it's nice to see a lot of young men come well dressed, often in 3-piece suits, but not always, and it's really good to see them dressed like grown-ups. I think that's a real plus. I had a rule that I didn't write in 12 rules, which was dress like the person you want to be. I kind of took that from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche said every great man is an actor of his own ideal. It's a very nice aphorism, and basically what it meant was that sometimes you have to act out what you want to be before you become it. You have to pretend. And it's not a lie. It's really a pretense, like children pretend to be a father before they grow up and become a father. It's a form of practice. And so tip 1 might be figure out who you want to be. Tip 2 might be, well, then dress like that person. That's a good start. And because I think if you want to become who you want to be, then no detail is too small to overlook. And certainly it isn't exactly that people judge you by your clothes, although they do to some degree. It's that if whatever you can have going for you, you might as well have going for you. That's how it looks to me. And certainly my experience has been that the response to my improved wardrobe has indicated that the investment was clearly worth it, indisputably and clearly worth it. And it's nice to be dressed sharply to go in front of an audience. It's a sign of respect to the audience. There's other ways of showing respect to an audience, but that's certainly one. And so it's been extraordinarily worthwhile. I would say if you're going for a job interview, if you're at any critical point in your life, then you should dress the part, because you want to do everything you can to tip the scales not in your favor exactly, but in favor of having the right thing happen. When I went on tour in 2018, before I went out, I thought I wanted to do this like 100% right, or at least as close to that as I could manage. So I went out and bought some expensive suits, and I spent way more money on. This is one of them, actually.
You look great, by the way.
Thank you,
Okay.
thank you. Way more money than I ever thought I'd spend on clothes, and I really felt quite bad about it. I thought maybe it was an extravagance, but I thought, no way, man, I'm going to see if I can nail this dead on, and I'm going to be speaking to, 100,000 people. I'm going to look as sharp as I possibly can. And one of the consequences of that has been that young men in particular come to the lecture tour dressed up in suits, 3-piece suits. Or the couples come and they're dressed up like they're coming to a wedding. So that's really something. And
why do you think that is? Is it because you set that
they're
standard?
sick of acting like kids.
Okay.
Our whole culture pushes the idea that teenage life, or even childhood for that matter, but teenage life is some sort of pinnacle, and then everybody dresses down so they look, especially men, they look like overgrown 10-year-olds, and there's something extremely demeaning about that. And so to provide people with the opportunity to dress up in a classic manner and to look like adults, to present themselves in that manner, there's something very attractive about that, because we haven't done that in our culture. That's been, I would say, downplayed in importance or for certainly since the 1960s.
Who's to blame for that? Because you recall, anytime you would fly in an airplane, if you see old school pictures, people would dress in 3-piece suits to go on an airplane. This is in the 60s, I assume. And then now you see someone like Mark Zuckerberg wear a t-shirt to give a speech in front of a TED Talk or something like that. So
Well,
who's to blame for this dress
some
down?
of it's just fashion. Fashion moves around, and it usually drifts from the top down. And so when formality becomes the norm, but that drifts down, say, to the working class, then the upper class thinks, well, we can't do that because that would, associate us with the unfashionable people, and then they dress down. And so then that drifts down the hierarchy. And so there's some of it's just fashion, but a lot of it too is this idea that this sort of reflexive, rebellious attitude that anything that violates traditional norms, or even anything that's associated with patriarchal oppression and adulthood, is to be eliminated in favor of what's hypothetically a more free individuality. But it's not, because everybody looks the same. I was in Washington 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer than that. It's probably longer than that, when I first went in the summer. And one of the things that really struck me, all these people wandering around these great monuments, is all the men looked like overgrown 10-year-olds. They looked exactly like their kids, except they were bigger. They looked like they'd been inflated with a bicycle pump. And I thought, this is weird that adults are dressing like children. I talked to my father about this years ago, because he always wore a suit when he was a teacher. He's still alive. He's a teacher, and he always wore a suit. And I asked him why one day, and he said because it was his way of showing respect for the students. And I mean, I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't dress in a suit is being disrespectful, but there's something about outfitting yourself for the task at hand. And there's also something about attempting to put some effort into putting your best foot forward. And I don't really buy the it takes more time in the morning argument. It takes a bit more time, but once you, before I went on this tour, I went through all my clothing and I tossed out everything that didn't fit, and which included a number of suits that were old, and I had to organize them, and that took about a day to get my closet in order.